There's a particular image of King Charles that keeps reappearing in the coverage of his reign over the past 2 years, and it's not the one you might expect. It's not the image of a monarch diminished by illness or one retreating quietly behind palace walls while his health is managed and his public appearances carefully rationed. It's almost the opposite. It's the image of a man who packs 10 to 12 engagements and meetings into a single day, who reportedly spends many a night alone in his study furiously writing letters and keeping up with paperwork well into the early hours of the morning. A man who, by the account of the royal biographer who has watched his first years on the throne most closely, is quite simply the happiest he has ever been in his role as monarch, despite being the same man who has been undergoing cancer treatment continuously since early 2024. The gap between those two realities, the ongoing illness and the apparently genuine contentment, is one of the most genuinely interesting and genuinely human stories unfolding anywhere in British public life right now. And it's a story that deserves to be told in its full complexity, because King Charles's difficult journey is, at the same time, something considerably more layered and more surprising than that adjective difficult might initially suggest. Let's go back to the very beginning of this particular chapter, because the sequence of how Charles's diagnosis actually came to light is itself a quietly remarkable story. In January of 2024, Buckingham Palace announced that the king would be undergoing what they described as a corrective procedure to treat a benign enlarged prostate, a common, non-threatening condition that comes with age and is managed routinely in men around the world every single day. It was framed as a fairly minor medical matter, the kind of thing that would require a short period of recuperation before normal life resumed. Charles checked into the London Clinic private hospital on the 26th of January and was discharged just 3 days later, but it was during that treatment, during the routine procedures connected to the prostate condition, that something else was found. Something that doctors hadn't been looking for, hadn't anticipated, and couldn't simply dismiss as another routine matter, requiring only a short period of rest. A separate issue of concern was noted, as the palace's official statement carefully economically put it. Further diagnostic tests confirmed what that deliberately understated language was already strongly suggesting. The king had cancer. A form of cancer was all the palace would say. Not prostate cancer, that much they specified. But the type, the stage, the precise nature of the diagnosis, none of that has ever been officially disclosed. And as of this writing, Buckingham Palace has still not confirmed exactly what kind of cancer King Charles has been living with and treating for more than 2 years. That deliberate withholding of specific medical detail has itself become one of the more talked about aspects of this whole situation. And it's worth taking a moment to understand why the palace chose this approach and what it says about the institution's relationship with public transparency, even on a subject as significant as the health of the sitting monarch. The official position, articulated early and maintained consistently throughout, is that the king is entitled to medical privacy like anyone else, and that the institution's obligation is to confirm the existence of a condition, explain broadly how it's being managed, and reassure the public that the monarch remains capable of fulfilling his duties, without providing the kind of granular clinical detail that would genuinely exceed what any private individual might reasonably be expected to share about their own health. Many observers have accepted that reasoning as entirely fair. Others have pushed back, arguing that a reigning monarch whose health has direct constitutional implications of the kind we've already discussed in previous conversations around the Regency Act and succession occupies a somewhat different position from a genuinely private individual, and that the public interest in knowing the true state of the sovereign's health is not simply idle curiosity, but something approaching a legitimate constitutional concern. Both of those positions are defensible, and the tension between them has run quietly but persistently beneath the surface of every single health-related royal story since February of 2024. What we do know, stitched together from official palace statements, from the king's own remarkably candid public messages, and from the reporting of royal correspondents who've covered this story closely throughout, is a picture that is both more encouraging and more humanly complex than the simple headline of "King has cancer" would suggest. We know that Charles began his cancer treatment immediately upon diagnosis, and that in the initial weeks, he did step back from public-facing duties while continuing to handle the administrative machinery of kingship, the red boxes of government papers, the correspondence, the behind-the-scenes business of the crown, behind closed doors. We know that that pause was genuinely brief. By the end of March of 2024, roughly 6 weeks after the cancer announcement, the king was back in public, making his first public appearances at church services, then gradually rebuilding toward a fuller schedule of official engagements, with what his team described as his doctor's full support. And what has happened since then, across the entirety of 2024 and 2025 and into this year, has been one of the more quietly remarkable demonstrations of personal determination and institutional commitment that the monarchy has produced in a very long time. Because here's what Charles actually did while receiving ongoing cancer treatment. He hosted state visits, not one or two carefully managed, low-key ceremonial occasions, but substantial, full diplomatic events including the French president, the American president, and the German president, major state visits that involve days of formal engagements, ceremonial duties, diplomatic meetings, and all the elaborate, exhausting pageantry that such occasions demand. He traveled abroad on official royal tours. He appeared at sporting events, opened hospitals and civic buildings, attended garden parties and investitures, received the credentials of incoming ambassadors, engaged with charities and community organizations across every corner of the United Kingdom. The Daily Mail's royal editor, Rebecca English, has described the king as famously packing in 10 to 12 engagements and meetings a day, with that word famously being precisely the right one, because this relentlessly full schedule has become something of a defining characteristic of his reign, a deliberate, sustained rebuttal to the idea that his health had fundamentally limited what kind of monarch he could be. One source of reporting has suggested he completed something approaching several hundred official engagements across a single year of treatment, a figure that would be respectable for a healthy monarch in their prime, let alone one undergoing active cancer treatment in their mid-70s. The question that naturally follows is why? Why maintain this kind of schedule during a period when any reasonable person, any doctor, any concerned family member would likely be urging significant rest and careful management of energy and stress? The answer seems to be layered and genuinely revealing about who Charles is as a person and what the crown means to him at this particular point in his life. Part of it is clearly institutional. A monarch who disappears from public life for an extended period, even with fully understandable medical justification, creates an institutional vacuum that generates speculation, concern, and an uncomfortable sense of drift that can damage public confidence in the crown itself. The optics of kingship, the visible, regular presence of the monarch performing duties and engaging with people, is not separate from the substance of kingship. It is, in a very real sense, part of the substance itself. Charles clearly understood this and apparently made a clear-eyed, deliberate decision to manage his treatment around his duties rather than the other way around, at least to the extent his doctors would allow. But there's another part of the answer that isn't institutional at all, and it's the part that the people who know him best keep returning to when they talk about how he's actually been during this period. Charles spent 70 years, literally 70 years, as the heir to the throne before finally becoming king in September of 2022 following his mother's death at Balmoral. 70 years of waiting, of preparing, of developing expertise and passion and conviction about issues ranging from architecture to agriculture to the environment, of being taken seriously sometimes and caricatured and dismissed at other times, of watching other people exercise the power he was born to hold while he waited and waited and waited. And then finally, at the age of 73, he became king, with a clearer sense of purpose and a longer list of things he wanted to do with that role than perhaps any new monarch in modern history. The idea that he would then quietly step back, reduce his commitments, and effectively narrow what he could do and see and accomplish because of a cancer diagnosis seems genuinely contrary to everything his character, as reported by the people closest to him, actually is. He has a reign's worth of purpose to fulfill, and by all accounts, a burning, urgent sense of how much he wants to do with it while he has the chance. This is what the royal biographer quoted at the beginning was really getting at when describing him as the happiest he has ever been. It isn't the happiness of someone oblivious to difficulty or in denial about the seriousness of his situation. It's the happiness of someone who has finally, at a very late stage in life, arrived at the thing they were built for and who refuses to let anything, including a cancer diagnosis, take that away from them before they've had a real chance to make the most of it. That's a genuinely moving human reality, and it's one that seems to resonate with the British public in ways that go well beyond simple monarchist sentiment. There's something almost universally recognizable in the image of someone facing serious illness, not with retreat or despair, but with a redoubled determination to do the things that genuinely matter to them, to show up, to be present, to keep going. Then came December of 2025, and a moment that, in its own quiet way, was one of the more significant royal media moments of recent years. Charles agreed to film a personal video message for the Stand Up to Cancer campaign, a rare, unusually direct piece of public communication about his own health from a man and an institution that had otherwise maintained careful, limited disclosure throughout the entire 2 years of treatment. The message was pre-recorded at Clarence House and broadcast on British television as part of the campaign's live event. And what he said in it was, for anyone who'd been following this story closely, genuinely striking on multiple levels. He spoke about his own cancer journey in language that was personal, warm, and specifically designed not to center on himself, but to use his own experience as a vehicle for encouraging others to get screened. He noted, with what he described as deep personal concern, that at least 9 million people in Britain were not up to date with the cancer screening available to them, and he made a direct, personal plea for people to act in language that was far more direct and emotionally engaged than formal royal statements typically allow themselves to be. And then, almost as an aside, he confirmed the news that the palace simultaneously announced through its official spokesperson. His treatment schedule was being reduced. His doctors had told him that the ongoing measures would move into what was being called a precautionary phase. He would be able to lead a fuller and more active life in the year ahead. He described this milestone as both a personal blessing and a testimony, in his own words, to the remarkable advances that have been made in cancer care. The specific phrase precautionary phase is one worth sitting with because it's doing considerable work in that official statement. It doesn't say remission, it doesn't say cured, it doesn't say the cancer is gone. It says the ongoing measures, meaning the medical oversight and monitoring, continue, but that the intensity and frequency of treatment has been significantly reduced because the king's response to that treatment has been, in the palace's own description, exceptional. Royal correspondents and medical commentators who analyzed the statement in the days following its release were broadly cautious about overstating what it meant, because the careful, hedged language used by the palace was itself a signal that this wasn't a clean, simple all clear. It was a positive development, a meaningful step forward in a journey that remains ongoing, one that will continue to be monitored and reviewed, as the spokesperson put it, to protect and prioritize his continued recovery. The distinction matters, not to be pessimistic about what is genuinely encouraging news, but to understand the actual situation clearly rather than allowing relief and goodwill to shade into a false sense that the difficult chapter is entirely over and resolved. What has become increasingly clear, though, watching how Charles has navigated this entire period, is that the difficult journey he's been on isn't simply a medical story, even if the cancer diagnosis is what generated the headlines. It's also a story about what it means to be a new king, still establishing the shape and purpose and identity of a reign, while simultaneously managing a serious personal health crisis, while simultaneously weathering the most damaging family scandal the monarchy has faced in decades in the form of the Andrew situation, while simultaneously managing the complicated, unresolved dynamic with his younger son Harry, who remains in America and whose relationship with the family continues to generate its own separate, never quite resolved stream of coverage and public commentary. Any one of those things would be genuinely demanding for a man in his mid-70s. All of them at once, layered on top of each other, while also attempting to fulfill the specific, defined, constitutionally significant role of King of the United Kingdom, is the kind of pressure that very few people in the world will ever understand from personal experience, and that most of us can only begin to imagine from the outside. And yet, the picture that keeps emerging from the people who actually see and work with him regularly is not of someone being ground down by that accumulated weight, but of someone who has, in some genuinely paradoxical way, found the experience of facing it all simultaneously clarifying rather than simply crushing. The cancer diagnosis, by multiple accounts from those close to him, has sharpened rather than diminished his sense of what he's there to do and why it matters. It's produced a king who is more direct, more willing to speak personally and without the old formal distance about difficult subjects, whether that's the importance of cancer screening or the value of palliative care or the way serious illness forces you to confront what actually matters in your life. This directness, this willingness to use his own experience as a platform for genuine public health messaging rather than simply managing optics, has itself been one of the more commented upon and genuinely valued aspects of how he's handled all of this. The Stand Up to Cancer broadcast was watched by millions of people, and the response from cancer charities, from oncology professionals, from ordinary people who'd had their own or a loved one's cancer caught early because of the public conversation around the king's own diagnosis, was substantial and deeply felt. There's a statistical dimension to that impact worth mentioning specifically because Charles himself flagged it in his December broadcast, and it genuinely matters beyond the royal story. After Buckingham Palace first announced his cancer diagnosis in February of 2024, the NHS reported a significant and measurable spike in the number of people contacting their doctors to discuss cancer symptoms or to arrange the screenings they'd been putting off. The same phenomenon has been documented in other countries following the public disclosure of a well-known figure's cancer diagnosis, sometimes called the celebrity effect in public health research, and Charles's own case appears to have produced exactly this kind of ripple effect, driving real, measurable improvements in early presentation and screening uptake at a moment when NHS cancer services were already under considerable strain. That's a genuinely significant, real-world consequence of the decision to make the diagnosis public rather than managing it privately and quietly, as previous generations of the royal family almost certainly would have done, and it's one that Charles himself has taken evident, genuine satisfaction from. describing himself as greatly encouraged by the outpouring of support and by hearing from people who told him that his openness had prompted them to finally get checked themselves. So where does the journey currently stand as we reach the middle of this year? The most honest answer is one of cautious, qualified, but real forward momentum. The treatment schedule has been reduced. The king's response to treatment has been described by his own medical team as exceptional. He is maintaining a full schedule of public engagements, including major state visits and domestic official duties, at a pace that has genuinely surprised many observers given that he is still formally under medical supervision that the palace itself describes as ongoing. He has spoken repeatedly and with evident feeling about the broader purpose his illness has given him in terms of public health advocacy and about the community of care, his own phrase that surrounds every cancer patient, language that suggests someone who has genuinely absorbed the human experience of serious illness rather than simply managed it from a clinical distance. And alongside all of this, he is doing what he has always apparently most wanted to do, which is simply to be king, fully, actively, pressingly, in a way that the longest apprenticeship in British royal history had made him more than ready for. The difficult journey continues, as it does for every person living with cancer or its aftermath, navigating a reality in which uncertainty doesn't simply disappear because the most recent news is encouraging. But what King Charles seems to have found, somewhat against the odds of what many people might have predicted when the diagnosis was first made public, is a way of making that difficult journey not just bearable, but in some genuinely meaningful sense, purposeful, not in spite of the difficulty, but partly through it, through the enforced clarity and the deepened sense of what actually matters that serious illness, for some people, actually produces. That isn't the expected royal story. It isn't the expected human story either. But it is, by most credible accounts, the true one. And in a world of carefully managed royal messaging and institutional communication strategies, something that reads as genuinely simply true is worth paying close attention to.